Welcome to Freshwater People. I'm Lisa John Rogers. The Great Lakes region was once a major logging hub. In the mid to late 1800s, it was supplying lumber to growing cities like Chicago and created boom towns that later had to deal with deforestation. Now our region's old-growth forests are extremely rare. In an effort to repopulate the region with trees over the next 10 years, binational organizations like the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers are aiming to plant 250 million trees. In 2024, they already managed to plant more than 27 million. But tending to a forest is more than just seeding trees and lamenting about the lumber industry, according to Ethan Tapper. He says these two things don't necessarily need to be in opposition. Ethan is a forester and writer who manages Bear Island, which is his 175-acre forest and homestead in Vermont. Today, he's here to talk with us about his recently published book, How to Love a Forest. Ethan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Lisa.
So what does loving a forest mean to you?
To give you a little bit of background about myself, professionally, I'm a forester, and I think that sort of in the same vein as what your question is, what does it mean to love a forest, can mean a lot of different things. Being a forester can mean a lot of different things, and I think it's sort of like the different types of foresters or different ways that foresters see themselves sort of illustrates this. So I think that if you were to ask some foresters what their job is, they would define it, largely as how are we managing this resource, which, by the way, is a good resource. Wood, it's a local renewable resource. There's a lot of amazing things about it, and we want more local renewable resources, right? But if we think about, sort of in this new school of forestry, the forestry like we do here in Vermont, and there are many others all across the country that I meet all the time who think about forests this way as well. We are proud to produce that resource, but we're also thinking about forests in a more holistic way. So we're like, we have these ecosystems that are not just beautiful, but are also foundational to our lives and to our quality of life, and to our lives and to the quality of life of every living thing that lives on this planet. And how do we protect that thing, that ecosystem, on all those species that depend on it, ourselves included, in this moment that we find ourselves in? And so, there's a bunch of different aspects of that. I think that uh, an old school understanding of what we do to care for forests would say something like forests need to be managed, right? They have to be managed or they can't grow, which isn't true. And another old school understanding of sort of in the vein of environmentalism or preservation might say that all we need to do to care for forests is to do nothing. Leave them alone. Everything will be fine. Just get humans out of them, which is also at this moment of in time not true. And so we need to navigate this like really complex reality where we have these forests that are really altered and degraded, and in this era of climate change and biodiversity loss and mass extinction and increasing human demands on forests, and to figure out how we care for these ecosystems in light of all that stuff, which involves in some cases doing less and in some cases doing much more.
Hmm. What would you say are some of the biggest misconceptions people have about what exactly makes a forest healthy?
So I think the question of like what is a healthy forest, I think if you know a little bit about forests, it's so simple. And the more you know about it, the more you know about forests and forest ecology, the more complicated it gets, to the point where I'm like, geez, do I know what the answer to that question is? So in its simplest sense, most people would be like, all right, well, a forest is healthy if it has a lot of healthy trees. And we would define healthy trees as these trees that are sort of like metabolically healthy. So they don't have any like wounds or defects or stressors. There's nothing standing in the way of just reproducing and growing and thriving and being like a healthy tree. But then when you look at healthy forest ecology more deeply, what you see is that, yes, we want to have a lot of healthy trees like that, but also there are all of these other values that occur in forests that come along with not just like these metabolically healthy trees, but also trees that are like old and sort of like unhealthy in a traditional sense, or even with tree mortality, this natural process that is as foundational to forest ecology as living trees. It's been happening as long as trees have been alive, and there's literally thousands of species of living things that have built their lives and their evolutionary identities around not just living trees, but this process of tree mortality. So when I think about what a healthy forest looks like, what I try to do is not just focus on we just need this plantation of all healthy, perfect trees, but to think about this system more broadly. And a lot of times, what we can do to sort of think about what a healthy forest might look like where we are is to look at what forests have looked like for thousands of years on this landscape in the past. So the answer to that question will be different where your listeners are than where I am. Where I am, fire wasn't a big part of our forest ecology. We in Vermont, we colloquially we call a forest the asbestos forest, the forest that don't burn. And the biggest source of like change in our forests and what allowed them to become what they were for thousands of years was mortality from wind. So we have these like modern hardwood forests. In some cases, we have these more boreal forest types mixed together. And we don't, in an old growth forest, as we call them, we wouldn't have seen for thousands of years on this landscape, just like a park of these big ancient trees. We would have seen this multi-generational forest. This forest was all different shapes and sizes and ages and species of trees, all mixed together. Every one of those generations coming from a natural disturbance, often wind throw or natural mortality of other kinds, creating opportunities for other plants and trees to grow, new generations of trees to grow. We would have seen deadwood on the ground. We would have seen these big old trees that are, sort of like complex and have cavities, holes in the trees, and all of these other things. Well, and it's important. And if you were in other parts of the country, by the way, what your old growth forest would look like would be different. There are many places in the United States where there actually would have been very little forests or very wildly spaced trees where they would have had these fire adapted grassland species where now are all these closed canopy forests as a result of the displacement of fire, both human fire from indigenous peoples and natural fire, and also the herds of these large ungulates, like these hundreds of millions of buffalo that used to exist there. So like where what the expression of that sort of like old growth forest type where you are would be different. But the reason that it's important, the reason I'm bringing it up right now, and the reason that it's important to talk about is because the conditions that we would have found in those old growth forests that would have been present on our landscape for thousands of years until just a couple hundred years ago, those are the conditions that all of our native species are adapted to. And when we look at our modern forests, in many cases, we see that they are missing or lacking every single one of those conditions. So here in Vermont, instead of having those forests that are complex and multi-generational with those big trees, and these gappy, irregular canopy, and this deadwood on the ground, we see these forests that by and large are very simple, dominated by a single generation of trees that are recovering from being managed as agricultural land for centuries. And so, what I really try to do as a forester, as an ecologist, is to bring these forests back using active management, the cutting of trees when necessary to do so.
Can you recall the moment when your perspective of trees first changed? I'm thinking of when you describe seeing them as a community for the first time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that sort of in my journey, I have a sort of a multi part story that I tell, like my origin story. One part of it is that I grew up in rural Vermont and surrounded by forests, but wasn't interested in them, which I think is kind of funny now that I get to talk to like naturalists and ecologists and biologists. I mean, some of my heroes, these nature writers, uh, all of them were like, "Oh, we always knew we wanted to work in forests. We always knew that we loved trees and that we loved wildlife." And that wasn't my experience at all. I was around those things growing up, but I had no idea that those were going to be a big part of my life. And then I, through a series of kind of like random occurrences, ended up going on this wilderness expedition for 6 months in the woods of Vermont, New Hampshire. And it totally changed my life. And then I ended up working as a wilderness guy. I like lived in the woods. I lived in this uninsulated yurt with a fir bow floor for a year. And I worked as draft animals, did a little draft horse logging. And then when I went back to school, I sort of picked forestry randomly just because it had the word forest in it. Truly, that's all I knew about it. I didn't know what it was. And it ended up being a really good fit, obviously. Uh, But when I went back to school, so first I didn't care at all. And then I cared very deeply about forests. But I thought that I knew everything about them, and I had this sort of attitude, which was this sort of like leave no trace, hands off attitude. All we got to do to take care of these ecosystems is just get humans out of them. And then I went to forestry school and I started learning about things like natural history and landscape history and wildlife biology and ecology and dendrology and soil science and hydrology and all of these other disciplines that combine to create this thing that we call forestry and forest ecology. And I realized that my understanding of forests that I had, both as a child growing up in a rural place surrounded by forests, but then even as someone who was really actively invested in these forests, as like a wilderness guide, I hadn't understood forests very well at all. And, I had just thought that they were these perfect, pristine, utopian places that were as they'd always been, and all that they needed to be happy and healthy was just to be left alone. And then you start to realize that they're subject to these massive, harmful histories, and that the forests that we have today on our landscape bear little resemblance to the forests that were here for thousands of years, and the forests that all of the species that make forests work need. And it was this really jarring experience because in some ways I had this like vision of forest that was so easy to appreciate. This vision of forest as these perfect places pulled away from me. And I had to see forests as they truly were. Now there's an interesting thing that happens. I call it deepening, which is where, the people in many cases that sort of hold this monolithic view that either uh, we can just continue to exploit and degrade forests, or that we just have to leave them alone and it will be fine. Um, I would call them delusional, right? It's delusional, and it's delusional to think in both directions, right? It's delusional to think that we can continue to exploit and degrade these ecosystems that make our lives possible and that they'll just magically be okay. And it's delusional to think that these ecosystems that have been exploited and degraded for centuries, that have lost species and had new species introduced, fundamentally disrupted their ability to function, that they will magically be okay if we're just able to somehow magically remove ourselves from them, which we can't do anyway. And that is not a view that is held by those of us who have actually dedicated our lives to the study and the care of these ecosystems. Because when we go deeper, you start to see them as they truly are. And you start to see that actually the situation is not as simple as sort of either of those polarities would have us believe, that it's massively complex. And that what it means to care for, to love these ecosystems is also this massively complex undertaking, which requires us to understand when it's appropriate to do nothing. And when we need to do actions, even actions that are like as complex, as bittersweet, as confusing at times as like cutting a tree to make a forest healthier.
From your perspective, how could the lumber industry and forestry better evolve together?
I think really, you know, it's an interesting question because um, a lot of we need to think about the question in a really nuanced way, right? Like I think one thing is that we end up in these sort of like polarized camps where it's like I'm an environmentalist and I hate the lumber industry, or I'm in the lumber industry and I hate environmentalists, when really it is completely possible, if we're willing to like step back a little bit, to attain both of the things that those people want while having better ecological and human outcomes. And the way that we do this is by folks who are mostly focused on the resource, timber, stepping back and realizing, starting to see the work that they do within the context of these ecosystems, that we actually can have no timber without healthy forest ecosystems, and that there are absolutely ways, maybe not to maximize that resource, but certainly to harvest wood in a way that is completely in keeping with how we maintain healthy forest ecosystems, and even doing so while we enrich and restore forest ecosystems. And then sort of in the other polarity, it's really important in the environmentalist community that we go a little bit deeper, and that we understand that what we want as environmentalists is a world that works. And we want people to have the resources they need to live these happy and healthy and abundant lives. And we want to use wood. We want to use wood instead of these more harmful in ecological and human senses, more harmful resources. We want to use local resources instead of these resources that are produced across the world. And then if we allow ourselves to think a little bit more deeply about it, we'll realize that wood is this like amazing resource. And the only question is, how do we harvest it in the right way? And it doesn't benefit us or anyone else or any other species on this planet for us to just have these like super polarized and really simplistic views about what we're trying to do here. And I think that what we'll find out is that if we're willing to sort of like step out of those polarities, that really what those two groups want, and this is a massive oversimplification, of course, to just be like there's two groups, but what those two polarities of thought want can be achieved at the same time with really minimal compromises.
In your book, you talk about how humbling it is to recognize that our lives will always come at a cost, that we'll always need to consume to survive. So our only choice is, what do we want our impact to be? And what do you want your impact to be?
Boy, yeah, I feel like what I'm really trying to speak to, I think if you read How to Love a Forest, some folks from here in Vermont are like, "Ooh, wish it was like a cookbook." Do this, cut this tree in your forest, and your forest will be healthier. And of course, not only is every forest, well, I will live extremely variable, and there's no way that I could tell you specifically what to do in your forest in every case. But then, of course, we have these ecosystems across this continent and beyond that are all also really different. So, what I really am interested in talking about is just sort of this concept of ecological responsibility, which is, I believe, hand in hand with human responsibility, with the responsibility that we carry to not just care for these ecosystems, but to care for each other. And I really want people to understand that the ability that we have to help ecosystems and to help each other is immense. But that also, there are no perfect solutions. And what we're really trying to do here is not to find like one answer to all of our problems, but to like figure it out, which is this messy process and which is uncomfortable and which is like really nuanced, complex, but is completely attainable. One thing I often tell people about ecosystems is that it is completely possible to solve all of the problems that our ecosystems face, not with some space age like moonshot technology, but with existing resources and existing technology. We just have to decide to do it. And we just have to be willing to like come out of these camps and do stuff, right? And to be willing to change the way that we think about stuff. And then we'll realize that actually, like, it's completely possible. One of the stories I tell in the book is about Bear Island, which is my land, which when I got here was the most degraded forest I'd ever seen. And I didn't know what to do about it, even though I'd been working as a professional forester. It was just too big of a problem. And so what I started doing was figuring out solutions. And a lot of them, as much as I would love to say that it was just I had to fill my pockets with wildflower seeds and cast them across the mountain and everything would be fine. It was much more complicated than that, right? And it involved me doing stuff like, cutting trees, thousands of trees, and killing deer, teaching myself to be a deer hunter because deer overpopulation is a problem here, as it is almost across this entire continent that really interferes with forest's ability to be healthy, a human created problem. I had to control all these introduced plant species. I had to teach myself to run an excavator, like all these different things that we would never think of as being part of how we restore ecosystems, how we protect this thing that we call nature. And yet, over the last 8 years that I've been here, I've just been able to see this profound transformation. And this land, Bear Island, has really become, which by the way is not an actual island, it's a metaphorical island, has become, in my mind, it's gone from being sort of this symbol of everything that's wrong with the world, this forest with every problem that a forest could have, to, in my eyes, really being a symbol of hope and being a symbol of what's possible if we're willing to make these decisions and to take action, to do things that are hard, to care for our ecosystems.
How has your relationship with trees informed or changed your relationship with people or animals?
Oh, such a great question. You know what's funny about trees? is that we used to joke in forestry school, of course, all we do is like think about trees all day long. And we would joke, we'd be like, they're just big plants. What's there to know about tree? And of course, they're everything, right? Like they're literally making life on this planet possible, but they're just these big plants that they'll hold so much metaphor. There are these incredible things that like everybody can find some cool metaphor from trees and from forests that in some way illustrate some like powerful life lesson. And I feel the same. I have learned so much about forests. I think one of the things that I like to talk about is the parallels between healthy forests and healthy communities. So, you know, we would like to believe a lot of people have, these sort of mythologized ideas about forests where they think that they're these like perfect, pristine, utopian, perfect societies, totally collaborative, totally altruistic. And they're like, this is how our society should be. Totally collaborative, totally altruistic, perfect, utopian. And forests do have lessons to teach us about our communities, about our societies, but it's not that. I believe that what they really have to teach us is uh, comes from how they really are, which is not utopian, which is not perfect, but which is like messy and in process and imperfect, and this process which there is no destination to. It is just this never-ending process that goes on forever and is constantly changing and reinventing and pieces of it dying and regenerating. And I feel like that is really the lesson that we should take from forests about how to have these healthy societies is that they are imperfect and they are messy. And that's not a mistake. That's not something that makes them less interesting or less compelling or less beautiful. That's what makes them themselves, right? That's how they're supposed to be. And so when we engage in these processes, whether it's an ecological process or a process in our community, I think it's really neat to think about that if it feels messy and imperfect, that maybe that's exactly how it's supposed to be. Maybe that doesn't mean anything's wrong. Maybe that means it's working perfectly.
Hmm. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Ethan, for taking the time to chat with us today. It's been a real pleasure, and I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
To learn more, check out Ethan Tapper's book, How to Love a Forest, at bookshop.org, or check it out from your local library. You can find more Great Lakes stories on our YouTube channel or at greatlakesnow.org. While you're there, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on what's happening in the region.